Well, today brings us to the end of our Roman series. So I've really been enjoying um, journeying with you through the book of Romans, and I know my faith has been greatly strengthened as we've gone through. So for those who are here probably for the first time, who are visitors here, over the last 8 messages that I've given, we've been unpacking many of the glorious truths that are ours because of what Jesus did upon the cross for us. And we've seen that because of the gospel, because of the good news of Jesus, we are justified by faith. We are saved by grace. We are obedient by worship. We are covered by Jesus, set free by patience, secured by love, which brings us to our last message today, and that is faith by hearing. And I think it will make sense as we unpack it today. To start with, I want to share with you a story from the Old Testament. And in the history of Israel, there were many periods of their story where they were surrounded by nations that were very hostile towards them. There was a lot of warring going on with the surrounding nations, and one of those nations were the Syrians. And the Syrians, throughout the history, did a whole bunch of horrible things to people in Israel. They would sometimes go on raids to the villages. They would besiege cities, and there's some really graphic stories of things like that taking place. And sometimes they would take captives as slaves back in their homeland. And in the midst of all of this sort of madness that went on, the story that I'm going to share with you is a story that gives us a little insight into the incredible free grace of God. Now, one of the reasons why the king of Syria was so successful in his conquests was that he had an exceptional commander of his army. And this man was a mighty warrior. He was everything seemed to go well for him, except for one thing. This man was a leper. And you might be starting to realize the story I'm talking about. I'm looking at the story of Naaman. Now, in Naaman's house, there was a young slave girl who had been taken captive in a previous raid. We're not told the specifics of how all of that happened. But I imagine the story going something like this. This young girl is in Naaman's house, and Naaman's wife is completely distraught. And she's worried about her husband with this illness and all of the difficulty that this is creating. And possibly she's even there going about her things in the day. Maybe even she's starting to cry. And this young girl, I imagine her reaching out to this woman, Naaman's wife, and saying, "What's wrong? What's happening?" Or she probably would have known all the situation with Naaman, with the leprosy, and she says these words to Naaman's wife. She says, "If only we were back in Israel." And I imagine this woman looking at her and saying, "What are you talking about? What do you mean? If only we were back in Israel. There's a prophet there who does these amazing miracles, and he could heal Naaman. How would he do this?" Well, the girl goes on to say, "I've heard these stories about this prophet doing amazing things. For example, there was this one time where there was this family, and the husband died, and the wife was left with all this debt, and it got to the point where she was going to have her children sold as slaves in order to pay off the debt. But then she went to this prophet, and he told her to go and collect all these jars, and then they went home and they went into their house, and they had this one little jar of oil, and they started pouring it into the jars, and it just kept pouring, and it just kept pouring and pouring, and soon all of those jars were filled, and they went and sold them, and they got all the money they needed, and they had much more left over in order to pay for all of their needs." But there's other stories as well. I remember hearing about this other story. There was a woman, and this time she had a son who she loved dearly, but this son suddenly got sick, and in fact died. But she went to this prophet and shared this situation, and this prophet Elisha came, and in fact Elisha raised her from the dead. It's an amazing story. Many people have heard this amazing story about this prophet in Israel, and I imagine this wife thinking, "Wow, if this prophet can help this distraught mother of these 2 children, and this other mother who lost her son, I wonder whether there's something that this prophet could do for my husband who has leprosy." And maybe when Naaman got home, that evening, she started sharing. The little girl that works for us was sharing this story about this prophet. I wonder whether he might be able to do something for you. And I imagine Naaman thinking, why would this foreign prophet from Israel, this place that we're often at war with, that we're enemies of, why would this foreign prophet ever be interested in helping me? But I imagine that the wife was saying, surely there's a way, surely there's a way. So the story goes on. Naaman goes to the king of Syria and tells him about this prophet. And maybe the king said the same thing. Why would this foreign prophet ever be interested in helping us? But he says, this is what I'll do. I'll give you a letter. I'll write a personal letter from me as one king to the king of Israel, and I'll send with you, as you go over there, an incredible gift to give to this king and to this prophet. And maybe if we give a big enough gift, they'll be interested in helping you. And so he gathers this gift, and it ends up being 10 talents of silver, which works out to be 340 kilograms of silver, and 6,000 shekels of gold, which is 60 kilograms of gold, and 10 new outfits. And if you convert this into modern sort of prices, this is an incredible treasure trove of wealth. This is an amazing amount of. This is a huge gift. One commentary that I was looking at, the IVP Bible Background Commentary, said the gift accompanying Naaman is exorbitant, a king's ransom. Converted to today's buying power, it would be in the vicinity of $750 million. This is an extravagant gift. 6,000 shekels of gold it was, and 10 shekels is how much you might earn in a year. So this is 600 years' wages in gold alone, let alone the silver and the clothes and everything else that went along. And so Naaman, I imagine carrying this much gold and silver, he probably didn't go alone. He probably had a number of chariots and soldiers in order to protect him on this journey down to Israel. And they go down there, and he goes to the king and he delivers this letter. Can you please heal? Can you heal me from my leprosy? And the king of Israel, he thinks, what on earth what is this? He tears his clothes and he says, this is surely a trick. Who am I? Am I God that I can heal you from this sickness? But Prophet Elisha, hears about this and he sends for him. And so Naaman gets all of his chariots and all of these gifts, and he goes down to Elisha, waiting to see what he will do. And Elisha, very strangely, he doesn't even come out of the house to visit Naaman, but he just sends his assistant out there, and the assistant goes out and says, Naaman, this is the message from the prophet. Go down to the river nearby, and I want you to wash yourself in there 7 times, and then you'll be healed from your illness of leprosy. And I imagine Naaman thinking, do you think that I came all the way here to wash in a river? There's better rivers back where I came from than this dirty river that's down over here in Israel. And it gets so to the point where he actually gets into it. It says he gets into a rage. And I imagine him looking at all this gold and silver, and he's thinking, I'm here to give you this in order for you to come out and get the prophet to come out and wave his hand over and say some magic spell and to heal me. But what is this? Go and wash in the river. And he turns around and he's about to leave and give up on this whole endeavor. And Naaman's servant says to him, imagine if Elisha, this prophet, had asked you to do something great. Wouldn't you have done it? What about just this small thing? It's just a little thing. Maybe you should give that a go as well. And Naaman there sees the logic. He was willing to bring this huge lot of gold and silver. He was willing to do whatever the prophet asked him. Maybe he can try this very simple little thing as well. And he goes down into the river there, and he washes himself once, twice, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7th time he comes out of the water, and I imagine he just felt this surge of power go through his body, and he looks down at his arms and he touches his face, and he realizes that he's healed. The leprosy is gone. And more than that, his body is restored back to back to fullness of health. And I imagine him just being so excited. And he races back to Elisha. And Elisha comes out this time and he says, Elisha, I can see now that there is a God in Israel. In fact, your God is the greatest God. And he's just so amazed. And he says, Elisha, I have this gift for you. Take this gift. Take this gold and silver. And just imagine what all of this could have done for Israel. All of the poor and the needy across the land. This could have done so much for the nation. But Elisha says, thank you for offering all of that, but I want you to know that I will have none of this gift. And Naaman's thinking, but look at it all, it's so much. And Elisha says to Naaman, as surely as God lives, I am not going to take that gift. This miracle from God is not something that is being sold to you, but rather it's this free gift. It's this free gift that's for you. And it's yours. Take it and go on your way. No matter what you say, you're not going to convince me. I'm not accepting your gift. And so Naaman goes on his way back towards Syria. Now, you might be familiar with the rest of the story, how Elisha's servant goes and tries to get some of that money. But when we just see this story as a whole, I love this story because in the midst of this place where there's warfare and chaos and children being taken captive as servants and all of these things going on, we see this little glimpse at the love of God. We see this little glimpse at the heart of God. Naaman there is this enemy. The size of the gift shows that he realizes it's very unlikely for him to ever be received favorably by this foreign king. But what does God do? He shows him grace. It's a wonderful, free grace that is given to Naaman. God looks down and says, I know you don't deserve this, but I love you. I want to save you. Just trust me, and the gift is yours. Now, the reason I share this story with you is that this picture of God that we see in his dealing with this commander of this foreign army, this picture of God is very similar to the picture of God that we see in the book of Romans. We are all, in many ways, like Naaman. But in fact, we are worse than the situation Naaman finds himself in. He had this terrible sickness of leprosy, but we have an even worse sickness, the sickness of sin. And we are all, as a result of this, an enemy of God. We are all broken. We are all sick. And there is no cure to this problem that we have. The situation is completely hopeless. But remember those two words that we looked at the very beginning of the series. But now. But now. Romans says, but now that the gospel has come, but now that Jesus has come to this earth, lived a perfect life, died the death that you deserve, and has risen from the dead, but now there is a new path forwards. But now God's grace is available for us. I want to share with you, as we are sort of bringing this series to a close, I want to remind you of Romans chapter 3, verse 20 to 24. And this is, in many ways, this is sort of the heart of the whole message of the book of Romans. And it says in verse 20, for by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. And what this is saying is that the way that we find ourselves being saved and healed from sin and right with God and receiving eternal life and all those sorts of things, it's nothing to do with what we do ourselves. We don't have to work for it. We don't have to earn it. We don't have to recommend ourselves to God. We don't have to come with this huge gift of gold and silver to bring to God and convince Him to save us. Because if we try to do it through law keeping, all the law does is just point out just how sinful we are. But now, verse 21 says, but now the righteousness of God, or a way of being right with God, has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. And just as God asked Naaman to lay aside all of those achievements and all of those gifts, and just simply to do one simple little act, to simply demonstrate his faith in the promise, God is saying to us that if we lay aside all of our doings, all of our efforts to earn a right standing with God, and we just simply come and come to God with faith, then we will be made right with God. And it goes on to say, for there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift. There we go. And with Naaman, I think the reason that the story that God got Elisha to interact with him in this way is that God wanted to show this little insight that the blessings of God come to us as a gift. We can't purchase them. And that's what was for Naaman, and that is what for us, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. What God did for Naaman, he has done for everyone, the undeserved free gift of salvation. Now in the story, Naaman comes ready to purchase his salvation. And as I was saying, this $750 million worth of gold and silver. He came there to earn the healing he desired. But it was not until he stopped trusting in what he brought, the gold, the silver, what he could do, and instead trust in the promise, he was healed. And this is the lesson that Romans has been teaching us over and over again as we've gone through. If we ever hope to be forgiven, if we ever hope to be saved, we need to shift our trust from ourselves to that beautiful promise of Jesus. His life, death, and resurrection is all that we need to be made right. Romans 4 verse 5, I think this is one of the most beautiful verses in the book of Romans. It says, and to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. In life, we are taught that if we want the approval of others, we need to earn it. And we get told this message in many different ways. You need to look the right way to get the approval of others. You need to have the right stuff. You need to have the right job. You need to have the right friends. You need to have the right behavior. If you do all the things right, you will earn the approval of others. And that's the message that is told to us over and over and over again. But when it comes to God, he says there's a different way to be right with him. Simply come just as you are and put your belief in what Jesus has done for us. And a nice little way to illustrate it that you might have seen people do before. The change that we need to... Just turn that off. The change that we need to do is kind of like sitting in a chair. If you think about what you need to do to hold your body up. At the moment, I'm standing here and I'm relying upon this leg and this leg to hold my weight up. I'm relying upon myself, aren't I? And I can stand on this leg. Now I'm relying on my right leg. I can shift that reliance to my left leg. But either way, I'm relying upon what I'm doing in order to hold my weight up. But when you sit down in a chair, you do something very interesting. You shift that reliance upon yourself to something completely separate to that. You sit back into the chair and you take your reliance off yourself, and instead you say, I'm now relying completely on this chair to hold me up. And the gospel is very similar to this. Our natural instinct is to try to do something that holds us up and recommends us to God. We trust ourselves in some way. But what Romans is teaching us is that what we need to do is sit back into the promise of what Jesus has done and shift our reliance not upon ourselves but onto what Jesus did in his life, death, and resurrection. And the moment that we do that, the promise is that we are forgiven and we are set free and we are saved. What God did for Naaman, he has done for every one of us. I want you to open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 10. Romans chapter 10. And we're going to finish our series by just unpacking this section here from this chapter. And in many ways, parts of this chapter is a little bit confusing because Paul quotes a lot of times to the Old Testament. And when you read through it, it's a bit tricky because you need to sort of go back to some of those quotes to try to unpack what he's saying. But I want to just unpack the message of the first part of Romans 10, and then we'll apply it to our big theme for today, which is faith by hearing. Romans chapter 10, verse 6 to 8 says this. But the righteousness based on faith, that's the righteousness that, like we're saying, the sitting in the chair righteousness. The righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Now this is a bit of a confusing passage, and the reason it's a bit confusing is what Paul is doing is he's taking little quotes out of the book of Deuteronomy. Now in the book of Deuteronomy, let's see where I'm up to there. In the book of Deuteronomy, we see Moses is giving instructions to the Israelites before they go into the promised land. And he's trying to encourage them to when they get into the promised land to not forget God and to not think that they've got there based on what they've done, but it's entirely because of what God has done for them. And as you get towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we see that Moses outlines a whole series of blessings and curses. And the blessings are something like this. If you obey God, then He will bless you in every way. He will bless your nation. He will bless your cities. He will bless your crops. He will bless you with many children. He will bless your livestock. He will bless you by giving you victory over all of your enemies. And He says things like this. And the Lord will make you the head and not the tail. And you shall go up and not come down, and not down, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God. God is going to bless you in all sorts of ways. But the book of Deuteronomy says, if you rebel against God, if you do not obey God, if you follow after other idols, then instead you'll receive a whole series of curses. And these curses, your nation will be broken, your city will fall apart, your crops will not produce fruit, your body will fail, your families will break apart, your enemies will conquer you, and you will be scattered throughout all of the surrounding nations. By the end of talking about that, Moses gives from God some promises for people who find themselves sometime down in the future having experienced these curses from rebelling against God, scattered in the surrounding nations. God gives them in the book of Deuteronomy some words, some promise of encouragement and hope for them during that time. What should they do if they find themselves at absolute rock bottom? Deuteronomy 30 verse 1 to 3 unpacks this. It says, in the future, when you experience all these blessings and curses I have listed for you, and when you are living among the nations to which the Lord your God has exiled you, take to heart all these instructions. If at that time you and your children return to the Lord your God, and if you obey with all your heart and all your soul all the commands I have given to you, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes. And so Moses is saying, no matter where you get to, no matter how bad the situation gets, if from wherever you are, you make a decision in your heart to return to God and to put Him first in your life again, God will, it says, restore all your fortunes. He will bring you back to Israel. He will re-establish you as His special possession in the earth. And what it says there is, all you need to do is, wherever you are, return to the Lord your God in your heart. And so it continues going on. The Lord your God will change your heart and the hearts of your descendants so that you will love Him with all your hearts and soul, and so that you may live. So in this instruction to Israel, it's saying that if you do this thing, return in your heart, God will restore you to your land, but He will also restore your hearts. And He will work in you with His Spirit to cause you to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then He says at the end of this instruction, He says, now what I am commanding you today is not difficult for you. It is not beyond your reach. In other words, you're not going to get to a stage where a situation is so bad that the solution is beyond your reach. Instead, in fact, Moses says, it is not up in heaven so that you have to ask, who will ascend into heaven and get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? Nor is it beyond the sea so that you have to ask, who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it? No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and it is your heart, so you may obey it. Now let me unpack what he's saying there. He's saying, no matter how bad the situation gets, if you find yourself at absolute rock bottom and your whole world around you is brokenness because of the sin, the path of sin that you have chosen, he says, the solution is never far away. The solution is never so far away that you have to ascend to heaven to find it. It's never so far away that you have to cross an ocean to secure it. No, the solution is always as close as this, your heart, and this, your mouth. The solution is never further away than your heart and your mouth. And the reason is, it's because it's with the heart that you make that decision to return to God, and it's with the mouth that you profess that decision that you've made within your heart. Now let's take all of this and we're going to bring it back to Romans chapter 10. So we'll read this one in our Bibles. Romans chapter 10. Again, we're going to read verse 6 to 8. It says, "But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your word and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim." What Paul is saying here is that no matter how bad a situation we find ourselves in, no matter how much we realize that we're at rock bottom because of the choices that we've made, the solution is never further away than our heart and our mouth. And I like how he adds these little things where he talks about bringing Christ down from heaven and bringing Christ up from the graves. What Paul is saying is that we're never asked to do what God has already done for us. We don't have to go up to heaven and bring Christ down. God has already sent him to this earth. We don't have to raise Jesus from the dead because God has already done that. God has already done all the hard work for us to be saved. All we need to do is the solution that lies right here in our heart and right here with our mouth. Well, what does that involve? How do we take hold of that salvation that God is offering us? We find this in the next verse, in verse 9. And I love this. This is one of the most simple little clear verses in the Bible about what we need to do in order to be saved. And it says this: "Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." That's as simple as it is. The solution is never further away than your mouth and your heart. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe with your heart that Jesus raised him from the dead, put that trust in what Jesus has done upon the cross, you will be saved. Now you might be thinking, Paul, that sounds a bit easy. Is it really that simple? Well, Paul goes on to quote another verse from the Old Testament just to convey just how simple this is. It goes in verse 13. Romans chapter 10 verse 13, he says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." I love that phrase. Whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. You don't need to have the right fancy words. You just need a heart and a mouth that calls upon Jesus. I think when I read this, I think about the thief on the cross. There he is hanging up there on the cross in all sorts of agony and pain. He doesn't say some fancy, elaborate speech to Jesus. He simply looks out to Jesus and he says, "Remember me." With his heart and his mouth, he calls out to God. And in that moment, Jesus reassures him that he is saved. So if it's so easy to be saved, why doesn't everyone call on Jesus? Why doesn't everyone take hold of the great treasure chest of blessings and riches that Jesus has offered to us freely as a gift? Well, Paul shares the reason why many people do not. And we find this in, we'll read starting with verse 13. So Romans 10 verse 13, he says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." But then he says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news." Here Paul makes a simple little logical progression. He says, salvation it just simply involves someone with their heart and their mouth calling out to Jesus for help. But Paul says, how will they ever do this unless they come to that place where they actually believe it in their hearts? And then he says, how will they ever believe it in their hearts if no one ever if they never hear the message of Jesus in the first place? How will they ever hear the message of Jesus if no one ever bothers to go and share it with them And how will anyone ever go and share it with them if no one ever gets sent and gets called to go and do that? And then he finishes with those beautiful words. How beautiful are the feet of those who preach good news. In this statement, Paul, in Romans here, he shares this sort of a tension that we see there. On one hand, God is responsible for the whole of our salvation. God is the one who came up with the plan of salvation. He's the one that sent Jesus. He's the one who sends the Spirit to speak to our hearts. He's the one who empowers us to live a better life. He's the one who's coming back again to save us. It's all of God. But for some reason, God chose to include us in that plan as well. For some reason, God decided to give us a part to play in bringing that good news to others. In verse 17 it says, "So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ." Now this is the reason why we encourage, as a church, encourage you to spend time in the Bible each day. Because when you're hearing the message of Jesus, is when you're hearing the word of God, it awakens that faith within your heart. This is the reason why we gather here together week after week and we have someone stand at the front and preach. Because when you hear the message of Jesus, it awakens that faith within your heart, which gives you access to all the treasures of heaven. And this is also the reason why we do things like the It Is God for Real program that's happening in just a few weeks. Because we believe that God has sent us to share this beautiful message with people. Because if they hear this message, they might just believe it. They might just call out to Jesus, and they will receive the incredible salvation that he offers them. Paul says in Romans chapter 1 verse 16, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes." Paul realized that if he can just get around and he can just share this wonderful news about Jesus, and if people are to accept it, that they will experience this incredible life and salvation that God offers them. He believed this so much that he was willing to, as a missionary, be persecuted. He was willing to be beaten, stoned, whipped, often near death. But he continued doing this in the hope that people, as they heard this message, would have that faith that awakens in their hearts. He continued to do this because he realized that God had sent him. But God didn't just send Paul. God also has sent me. And God has also sent each one of you as well. So as we finish this series, I want to finish with two simple challenges for you. The first one has to do with this in Romans chapter 10 verse 13, where Paul says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." Throughout the book of Romans, there's all sorts of technical theological words that he uses. There's all sorts of complex arguments. But he gets to the end and it gets to Romans chapter 10 where he's sort of summarizing it all. And he says, at the end of the day, it's as simple as this. Call out in your heart and with your mouth to Jesus and you will be saved. And so if you, as a result of hearing this, if you want to do that, you don't even need to say the words out loud. You can just whisper that prayer to Jesus in your heart. You don't need fancy words, but your words could look something like this. And I encourage you that if this is, as I read through this, if this is something that's true for you, I encourage you to, as we're talking about this, as I'm reading this out, let this be a prayer from you to God in your heart. God, I come before you as a broken sinner. I have nothing to bring that could ever earn your approval. I simply trust in what Jesus did for me on the cross. And I ask that the salvation that he offers would be mine. I encourage you, if you've never called out to Jesus with your heart, I encourage you to pray that prayer to Jesus right now. Let it go up to God and just call out to him. Tell him whatever you want to say, but take hold of what he has offered you as a result of the cross. And sit down into that chair and say, you know what, I'm no longer trusting in my own works, my own achievements, my own behavior, my own accomplishments. I'm now just simply trusting what Jesus has done for me.